Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are examining a fundamental pedagogical tension in language acquisition. Specifically, the conflict between prioritizing exact structural precision versus prioritizing natural fluency and mimicry.
Right. And the central question we are exploring today is whether language learners should strictly avoid complex, easily mispronounced structures like negative contractions in favor of grammatical clarity. Or, on the flip side, whether they should immediately embrace native-like speech patterns to build true fluency from day one.
Exactly. And we are grounding this debate entirely in contemporary English learning source material. We'll be looking at everything from rigorous grammatical worksheets on prepositions to immersive conversational scripts and audio shadowing exercises. To state my position clearly right off the bat, I argue that true mastery requires a bedrock of structural precision. Attempting natural speed before mastering exact articulation, particularly with high-stakes vocabulary, leads to critical communication breakdowns.
And my position is that language is fundamentally musical and contextual, not mathematical. Avoiding natural speech patterns produces artificial, robotic communication. If you want authentic, real-world fluency, immersive techniques have to be implemented immediately.
Well, to begin, I think we really have to look at the mechanical reality of spoken language, especially through the lens of early acquisition and the immense cognitive load it places on a learner. The danger of premature fluency is severe, and it is perfectly illustrated in the instructional material provided by Rebecca regarding English contractions.
You're talking about her warnings regarding negative contractions specifically, right?
Yes, exactly. She explicitly warns learners about the high risk associated with them. I mean, consider the semantic difference between you are not and you aren't. This isn't just about sounding a bit stiff versus sounding like a local. If a learner attempts to say you aren't or I won't, but they lack the phonetic precision to articulate that final T sound, they don't just sound slightly unnatural.
Right.
They communicate the exact opposite of their intention. You aren't becomes you are.
Yeah, the listener hears an affirmative instead of a negative. I get that.
Precisely. And that is not a stylistic error. It is a critical failure of communication. If you are negotiating a contract or giving medical information, that dropped consonant is disastrous. Therefore, clarity must supersede this desire to sound natural. I advocate for the mathematically precise, much safer route of saying you are not or I will not until the phonetic foundation is absolute.
Well, I come at it from a completely different way. I mean, the idea that we should artificially separate words to ensure mathematical precision, it fundamentally misunderstands how humans actually process speech in real time. Avoiding native speech patterns just creates an artificial barrier to real-world comprehension.
How is clarity a barrier?
Because nobody speaks like that in the real world. If you look at the Fluent U and English Easy Practice materials, they advocate heavily for shadowing, which, as we know, bypasses the analytical brain entirely by having the learner echo the audio word for word. They match the rhythm and intonation directly.
But doesn't that direct mimicry just create the illusion of competence? I mean, sure, they might sound great repeating a recording, but they don't have the underlying architecture to build their own sentences.
Not necessarily. Learning to speak is akin to training a muscle, not passing a calculus exam. The English Easy Practice methodology explicitly tells the learner to relax and try to understand the main idea. They shouldn't be obsessing over the precise articulation of every single syllable. When we look at the beginner conversational scripts provided by Vanessa, we see learners immediately immersed in contractions. Phrases like, "Aren't you ready?" and "It'll take all day" are introduced in Scene 1 of her dialogue.
Which is incredibly ambitious for Scene 1, almost recklessly so.
It is ambitious, but it proves that native-like flow is a day-one necessity. If we teach students to speak in perfectly separated, robotic syllables, training them to painstakingly enunciate, "It will take all day," we are training them for a version of English that simply does not exist in the wild. When they finally encounter a native speaker, they'll freeze because they've never been trained to parse connected speech.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on what
the wild actually requires. Let's expand on this issue of contractions using the pronunciation guide from Liz, which focuses heavily on British English. She provides a comprehensive list of contractions: I'll, you'd, shouldn't, and she even moves into highly specific cultural markers, like ma'am for female members of the royal family, or slang like ain't, utilizing a glottal stop.
The glottal stop is a perfect example of natural speech mechanics.
But think about the phonetic gymnastics required for an adult learner whose native language doesn't utilize that sound. Teaching a beginner to attempt a glottal stop with ain't, or risking a mispronounced won't sounding identical to want, is pedagogically reckless. It raises their affective filter and causes massive anxiety.
It doesn't have to cause anxiety if we don't treat it like a test.
But the real world is a test. Rebecca's material makes a profound point. If you make a grammatical mistake, it's not the end of the world. But if you make a mistake with a negative contraction, you are communicating incorrect information. It is unequivocally better for a learner to sound slightly robotic, yet be perfectly understood by their conversational partner, than to sound casually natural but convey false information because their tongue couldn't navigate a complex consonant cluster.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Native speakers do not wait for perfect articulation. They rely heavily on context, and they blend words constantly. If a student is sheltered from standard combinations like he'll or there in the classroom because we deem them, quote-unquote, too risky, they will completely lack the auditory processing skills to understand a native speaker talking at full speed.
But auditory processing and verbal production are two completely different skills. You can teach them to hear there without forcing them to say it before they are ready.
They are inextricably linked, though. Shadowing solves the exact pronunciation risk you are worried about by training the articulatory muscles to the music of the sentence. It doesn't treat language as a series of isolated phonetic traps. In the English Easy Practice shadowing exercise, the learner is repeating full, emotionally resonant phrases. Things like, I stepped into a big puddle, or that reminds me of the time I fell.
Yes, but
Let me finish this point. The rhythm itself carries the meaning. If you force a student to say, I will not be there, instead of I won't be there, you are actively preventing their brain from mapping the natural cadence of the language. And that cadence is precisely what allows native speakers to distinguish between won't and want in context.
that reliance on context is exactly where the methodology falters when it comes to structural realities. The music of a sentence cannot give you spatial coordinates. Let's shift to the rigorous preposition worksheets provided by Espresso English and Ellie. A student cannot simply shadow their way into understanding the precise spatial logic of the English language.
Okay, prepositions are notoriously difficult, I will grant you that.
They are, and they require a strict cognitive map. For instance, the Espresso English text explicitly delineates the pragmatics between on and on top of. You use on for a normal placement, like keys on the table. You use on top of for an unusual placement, like keys on top of the refrigerator.
Right, it adds an element of surprise or emphasis.
Exactly. Furthermore, they distinguish formal registers, noting that beneath is highly formal, whereas under is standard. Or consider the LII worksheet. It maps out an entirely different spatial coordinate system for the learner, forcing them to conceptualize above as a static, non-contact coordinate, as opposed to the dynamic movement of over, like a plane flying over the Eiffel Tower.
Sure, those are the textbook definitions.
They are the functional definitions. You cannot absorb the boundary between a formal and informal preposition or a static and moving preposition simply by mimicking the melody of a sentence. It requires explicit declarative knowledge. You need the mathematical rules first.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered that visual context provides these rules organically, and honestly, often more effectively than a worksheet ever could?
How so? A worksheet gives you the boundary explicitly. There is no guesswork.
But a worksheet doesn't give you the behavior. The shadowing materials specifically recommend using visual mediums to bypass rote memorization. Fluentu recommends short films like The Gift for shadowing simple verbs, or The Expert, which is a satirical video about an office meeting to shadow fast-paced British workplace vocabulary.
I'm familiar with those, but watching a workplace satire doesn't explain the rule of proximity.
It maps the language to human behavior, which is how we naturally acquire language. When a learner watches a character place something in a highly unusual spot, say a folder on top of a tall bookshelf, and say on top of, they absorb the pragmatics of that phrase instantly. They see the reach, they see the unusual placement, and they map the phrase to the physical reality. They don't need to memorize a textbook rule about whether an apple is beside or next to a banana, which, as the LEI worksheet points out, mean the exact same thing anyway, save for a slight shift in formality.
But there are rules that do not map perfectly to visual observation.
True, but memorizing that close to is the only proximity phrase that uses the word to, while near and by do not, is essentially a mathematical exercise. It causes the learner to over-monitor their speech. Have you seen the monitor overuse syndrome in students?
Of course.
A learner freezes mid-sentence because they are mentally flipping through a grammar textbook, trying to remember if near takes a to. Experiencing it through a short film, like Post-it, maps the language to action. They don't think about the rule. They just produce the language.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Human behavior in the context of daily tasks actually demands the very mathematical precision you were dismissing. The monitor overuse syndrome is a risk, I agree, but the alternate fluent inaccuracy is far worse when a task actually needs to be accomplished. Let's look at Vanessa's vocabulary guide for house cleaning and organizing.
You mean the conversational script with Dan?
Yes, but before the conversation, she establishes the foundational vocabulary. When we are dealing with spatial realities in a home, the language requires exact coordinates. If someone asks where the broom is to sweep the floor, answering behind the laundry basket versus in front of the laundry basket is a binary of right and wrong. There is no contextual nuance that will save you if you use the wrong preposition there. The listener will simply look in the wrong place.
But in a real household.
Let me finish this thought. The LE grammar notes show us the strict sentence patterns required. There is a cup of coffee on the table. Noun, verb, preposition, noun. If you are instructed to scrub the toilet with a scrub brush or wipe down the baseboards, you need exact vocabulary. Sink, mirror, cabinet, beneath, above. Without an explicit mental checklist of prepositional rules and targeted vocabulary, the learner cannot navigate the basic physical environment. It doesn't matter how beautifully they can mimic the intonation of a short film if they tell you the leak is above the sink when it's actually beneath it.
But look at the exact dialogue from Vanessa's own conversation script. It actually proves that real life is messy and does not follow a rigid coordinate system. When Dan is looking for the laundry basket, he doesn't give a perfectly structured robotic coordinate. He doesn't say, the laundry basket is situated perfectly next to the dresser.
What does he say then?
He says, it isn't on top of the dresser in the bedroom. And Vanessa responds with immediate emotion. I don't think everything will fit in the washer. It'll overflow. I'll start with the sheets. Dan eventually finds his hockey stick because there is something under the couch beside the lamp.
Right, he uses specific prepositions to locate it.
Standardly under it, they are communicating rapidly to solve a problem. They are dealing with overflowing laundry. Shadowing prepares the learner for this exact scenario, a scenario where words bleed into one another and the overall comprehension of the phrase, "Aren't you ready to tidy up?" matters far more than isolating the glottal stop or perfectly mapping the noun-verb preposition syntax.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the learner can safely skip the foundational steps to arrive at that rapid communication. Yes, Dan and Vanessa speak quickly, using contractions. Yes, it's messy and emotional. But they are relying on a deeply internalized, perfectly accurate structural map.
Do you really think they are consciously applying the rules in that moment?
Not consciously, no, because it is fossilized correctly. When Dan says it isn't on top of the dresser, he is utilizing the exact unusual placement rule from the Espresso English material, and he is utilizing the negative contraction perfectly. If a learner tries to mimic that speed without the structural bedrock and says it is on top of the dresser because they casually drop the NT, what happens? Vanessa goes to the bedroom, looks for a basket that isn't there, and the entire domestic task falls apart. The chaos of real life is exactly why the foundational rules must be pristine.
And yet, if that same learner is trained only to say, it is not on top of the dresser,
and they step out into the world and hear someone casually say, "It ain't there," or "It isn't there," they will lack the auditory processing to understand what was just said. The Fluent You text makes it clear. Shadowing gets you in the habit of speaking English out loud right from the start. You don't wait until you have mastered the grammatical difference between in back of and in the back of the classroom.
Even though one means outside the building and one means inside the room? That is a huge distinction.
It is a distinction, but you start speaking anyway. Minor errors are a natural, unavoidable rhythm of language acquisition. The insistence on perfect precision creates a paralysis that prevents the very communication it claims to protect. If a student is so terrified of mispronouncing won't that they resort to I will not, they inherently distance themselves from their conversational partner. They sound like a textbook.
Which changes the entire social dynamic of the interaction. Fluency isn't just about information transfer. It is about social cohesion. Shadowing films like The Gift teaches the empathy and timing of the language. I don't disagree that social cohesion is a major factor. But social cohesion breaks down entirely when trust in the information is lost. Let's look at the cognitive load again. If a student is focusing so heavily on mimicking the casual speed and emotional tone of a native speaker, they have very little working memory left to conjugate the verb correctly or select the right spatial preposition.
But shadowing actually lowers the cognitive load. That is the beauty of it. Because they aren't generating the sentence from scratch, they don't have to pull from a mental database of rules. They just ride the wave of the audio.
But eventually they have to generate their own sentences. They can't just echo what other people say for the rest of their lives. When it comes time to generate a novel sentence, say, explaining to a plumber where a pipe is leaking, they need the declarative knowledge. If they've only ever shadowed, they might confidently and fluently string together a sentence that is entirely grammatically incorrect and spatially confusing. Fluency without accuracy is just rapid-fire nonsense.
I think nonsense is a bit harsh. Context almost always fills in the gaps. If someone points to the ceiling and says, "The water is beneath the roof," instead of under the roof or leaking from above, the plumber knows what they mean. The communicative goal is achieved.
But why settle for almost when the materials give us the tools to be exact? The materials we've reviewed, from the high-stakes warnings regarding negative contractions on Engvid, to the rigid, rule-bound nature of prepositions of place in the LEI worksheets, demonstrate that foundational accuracy is achievable. It requires patience. It requires acknowledging that adults learn differently than children. Adults benefit from explicit grammar rules.
Adults also suffer from much higher anxiety when learning a language than children do.
True, which is why the careful avoidance of high-risk phonetic blends provides a reliable, safe path to clear, unambiguous communication. It gives them a safety net. Without that structural precision, fluency is merely the illusion of competence. It is a house built on sand. The moment they need to express a complex, high-stakes idea, the structure collapses.
I understand the desire for a safety net, but authentic fluency cannot be built in a sterile, mathematical vacuum. A house built on sand might be unstable, but a house built only of blueprints isn't a house at all. You can't live in it. The evidence from shadowing methodologies and beginner conversational scripts shows that learners must dive into the deep end of natural intonation, contractions, and connected speech.
Even if they make persistent mistakes?
Especially if they make mistakes. Accepting minor errors is a necessary part of acquiring the authentic rhythm of language. If you try to control every variable, every final T, every glottal stop, every prepositional nuance, the learner will be exhausted and mute. We have to trust the brain's ability to map patterns over time. That rhythm is ultimately what connects us in the real world, far more than whether we correctly chose beside over next to.
I will concede that our ultimate goal is identical. We both want effective, meaningful, real-world communication for the learner. It is clear from diving deeply into this source material that a synthesis of our perspectives is likely the reality of most successful language acquisition.
I agree. It is rarely an either-or in practice.
Exactly. One cannot effectively shadow a fast-paced British short film without some foundational understanding of the vocabulary and structures being used. You have to know what the words mean before the music of the sentence can truly resonate.
That is a fair point.
And conversely, one cannot deploy perfect prepositional grammar in a real-world setting without grasping the natural intonation, the contractions, and the speed at which native speakers actually deliver those coordinates. If you have the vocabulary but lack the rhythm, you will still be left behind in a fast-paced conversation.
The complexity of language learning presented in these materials, from the intense phonetic demands of negative contractions to the nuanced pragmatics of spatial prepositions, reveals just how multifaceted this journey is for any learner. It is a constant negotiation between math and music.
There is certainly much more to explore within these methodologies to fully understand how we acquire, process, and ultimately master a new language. We've only really scratched the surface of how cognitive load and working memory play into this.
We have. And we will leave it to the listener to weigh the evidence we've discussed today. They can determine whether they find the safety and clarity of structural precision or the authenticity and rhythm of immediate immersion to be the most vital first step in their own approach to the material. Thank you for joining us.